With a cold, calculating shove, the rich sun cast the bound elderly woman into the murky swamp waters. Her frail body, tied with rough ropes, slowly sank into the dark mud, while the sun's empty gaze drifted away, satisfied with the fate he had sealed, to be devoured by the alligators. To him, nature would take care of the problem. The scent of fresh meat and the movement on the surface attracted the silent, scaly shadows. Hungry yellow eyes emerged from the liquid darkness, sharp teeth ready for the cruel feast. But suddenly, a striped form burst from the dense vegetation. It was not a predator seeking easy prey, but a force of nature that recognized injustice. With a roar that echoed through the humid expanse, the tiger leaped into the muddy water. Its sharp claws and powerful teeth clashed against the reptile's armor. A fierce battle erupted, the water whipped into a maelstrom of fury and instinct. The tiger, a living wall of muscle and courage, fought not out of hunger, but to protect the defenseless woman, an unexpected link of life against death, imposed by human cruelty. The swamp exploded into primordial chaos. The tiger's roar, a guttural symphony of fury and defiance, tore through the humid silence, mingling with the dry snap of jaws and the nauseating sound of flesh and scales colliding. The water, once murky and stagnant, now boiled in a maelstrom of mud, blood, and foam. The tiger, its muscles rippling beneath its striped hide, was an unstoppable force. An orange and black lightning bolt, moving with surprising agility for its size. Its claws, sharp as razors, tore through the reptile's thick armor, while its teeth locked in a death grip, seeking vulnerable points between the bony plates. The alligators, ancestral predators of that muddy domain, did not retreat easily. There were many, and their hunting instinct, awakened by the scent of blood and the opportunity for an easy feast, spurred them on. One of them, a monster with yellow eyes and dark scales, tried to flank the feline, sliding silently beneath the surface. But the tiger, with keen perception, spun, its hind legs propelling it through the water. With a precise strike of its front paw, it hit the reptile's head, making it stumble and release a hiss of pain. The battle was not merely a fight for survival, it was a clash of wills, a deadly dance between instinctive ferocity and an almost supernatural courage. As the carnage unfolded around her, the bound elderly woman felt the weight of the water pulling her down. The cold, sticky mud already covered her knees, her thighs, and with each violent movement of the battle, she sank a little deeper. Panic, once a chilling wave, was now a silent scream in her throat. The metallic scent of blood filled her nostrils, and the sound of blows and snarls was deafening. She tried to struggle, but the wet, tight ropes cut into her skin, and exhaustion was already beginning to take its toll. Her lungs burned, desperate for air, and the dark water threatened to swallow her whole. But amidst the terror, an image fixed itself in her mind: the tiger. That majestic creature, a predator at the top of the food chain, was fighting for her. Not out of hunger, not for territory, but for a purpose she couldn't comprehend. Her eyes, once filled with despair, now watched the feline with a mix of awe and a faint spark of hope. She saw the tiger sink its claws into one of the alligators, tearing its soft belly in a swift, brutal movement. The reptile writhed, its tail lashing the water before its life ebbed away into the darkness. Still, the remaining alligators did not give up. They were persistent, moving in circles, looking for an opening, a flaw in the tiger's defense. One of them, larger and more cunning than the others, attempted a direct charge, its jaws opening in a menacing arc, revealing rows of dagger-sharp teeth. The tiger, with a warning roar, narrowly dodged, feeling the wind of death brush its fur. It counterattacked with renewed ferocity, its hind legs propelling it onto the reptile's back, sinking its claws and teeth into the alligator's nape. The animal thrashed violently, diving and surfacing, trying to drag the feline into the depths, where the advantage would be its. The elderly woman felt the current created by the struggle, and her body, already heavy with ropes and water, was dragged closer to the center of the battle. The mud rose, and the brackish water already touched her lips. She coughed, swallowing some of the bitter liquid and feeling the burn in her throat. Her eyes closed for an instant, the vision of imminent death clouding her mind. But then a strange force made her open them again. It was the tiger. It had released the injured alligator and, with a gaze that seemed to carry deep intelligence, fixed on her. It wasn't just fighting to fend off the reptiles. It was fighting to reach her. With one last defiant roar, the tiger turned, ignoring the alligators still circling it, and began to swim towards her. The water churned violently around it, but it advanced with singular focus. The alligators, seeing an opportunity, approached, but the tiger, with a swipe of its paw, kept the closest one at bay. It was exhausted, perhaps wounded, but its determination was unyielding. The elderly woman, with her last shred of strength, tried to lift her head, her eyes fixed on the predator who had become her improbable savior. Time was running out, and the swamp's darkness threatened to swallow them both. Time was running out, and the swamp's darkness threatened to swallow them both. With a final, powerful surge, the tiger broke through the barrier of water and mud, separating it from the elderly woman. Its amber eyes, once focused on the annihilation of the reptiles, now fixed on her with an almost supernatural intensity. It was not a domesticated animal, but in that moment, its presence was the only promise of life in a scenario of certain death. The water, already at the woman's neck, threatened to suffocate her at any instant. She coughed, choking on the filthy liquid, her lungs gasping for air. Exhaustion was a heavy veil covering her mind, but the sight of that majestic predator mere inches from her ignited a spark of strength she didn't know she still possessed. The tiger, ignoring its weariness and potential wounds, positioned itself between her and the alligators still circling. It was a living wall, a shield of muscle and stripes. One of the bolder reptiles attempted a swift charge, sliding underwater towards the woman. But the tiger, with surprising agility, intercepted it. Its claws, once used for tearing, now served to push, to ward off the threat, with a lateral blow that made the alligator stumble and retreat, hissing in frustration. The water boiled around them, and the scent of blood, both from the tiger and the wounded reptiles, was a macabre invitation to other unseen predators. The elderly woman, her head barely above the surface, felt the tiger's body brush against hers. There was no fear, only a strange sense of security. She watched the feline lower its head, sniffing the ropes that bound her. It was an instinctive gesture, an attempt to understand the barrier that held her captive. Its teeth, capable of crushing bones, were dangerously close to her skin. But there was no intent to harm. There was an urgency, a need to free her somehow. The tiger tried to bite the ropes, but the dampness and thickness made them resilient. It growled, a low, frustrated sound, as its eyes scanned the swamp, searching for a solution, or perhaps just another threat. The alligators, sensing the tiger's distraction, renewed their attack. They were creatures of the night, of darkness, and the opportunity for an easy feast was irresistible. 3 of them, the largest and most relentless, advanced in formation, their jaws open, revealing an arsenal of sharp teeth. The tiger, perceiving the imminent danger, let out a deafening roar, a warning that made the water tremble. It turned to face the attackers, but not before nudging the elderly woman with its head, a delicate but firm movement to push her away from the epicenter of the confrontation. The battle resumed with even greater fury. The tiger, now with the responsibility of protecting the woman, fought with desperate ferocity. It leaped, spun, its claws tearing into the reptile's flesh. One of the alligators managed to bite its hind leg, and a roar of pain escaped the feline's throat. Hot blood mingled with the swamp water, making it even darker and more sinister. The elderly woman, watching the struggle, felt her heart pound in her chest. She saw the pain in the tiger's eyes, the exhaustion in its movements, but also its unwavering determination. It would not give up. With each blow, each bite, the tiger seemed more wounded, but its will to fight did not wane. It fended off one alligator with a paw-swipe, only to bite another that dangerously approached the woman. The ropes, which once seemed a death sentence, were now an obstacle to her own salvation. She tried to move, to struggle, but the mud held her fast, and the water already covered her mouth. Panic returned, stronger than ever. She was drowning, and her savior, the majestic tiger, was being torn apart to protect her. Suddenly the largest of the alligators, a monster with ancient scars on its hide, made a final charge. It lunged out of the water, its jaws open at an impossible angle, aiming directly for the elderly woman's head. The tiger, despite being wounded and exhausted, reacted with stunning speed. It threw itself in front of her, intercepting the attack. The sound of the impact was brutal, a dry snap of bone and flesh. The tiger's claws sank into the reptile's throat, but the alligator's jaws clamped down on its front paw, crushing it with terrifying force. A roar of agony ripped through the air, a sound that echoed across the vast swamp. The tiger, its paw wounded and bleeding profusely, did not release the alligator. It held on, fighting to keep the creature away from the woman. The elderly woman, with water already invading her nostrils, saw the despair in the feline's eyes. It was sacrificing itself for her. Darkness began to envelop her, and the last image her tired eyes registered was that of the tiger, its majestic body trembling with pain, yet still an unbreakable barrier between her and death. The swamp was becoming a humid tomb, and hope, however faint, seemed to ebb away with her last breath. The darkness was not merely that of the murky swamp water, it was the darkness of approaching death, a cold, sticky veil that enveloped the elderly woman. The brackish water invaded her nostrils, burning, suffocating. Her lungs burned in a primordial desperation for air, but there was no air, only the filthy liquid pulling her into the abyss. Her eyes, once fixed on the tiger, now closed, the vision of the majestic predator fading like a mirage. The sound of battle, the roars and bone snaps, diminished, transforming into a distant hum, the prelude to eternal silence. She felt the weight of the ropes, the pressure of the mud, the cold that penetrated her bones. It was the end. Resignation, a terrible relief began to set in, but the tiger would not surrender. Even with its front paw crushed, hot blood streaming and mingling with the water, it would not allow that woman's life to be extinguished. A roar of fury and pain escaped its throat, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the swamp. It released the injured alligator, which thrashed and sank, and with its good paw, the only one that still gave it some advantage, it pushed the elderly woman's body upward. It was an agonizing effort, each movement an excruciating torture, but the image of the woman sinking was a trigger for a ferocity that transcended pain. The elderly woman's head emerged from the water for an instant, a precious lapse of seconds. She coughed violently, expelling water and mucus, and a desperate gasp filled her lungs. Life, by a thread, clung to her again. Her eyes opened, blurry, and the first thing she saw was the tiger's face so close she could feel the warmth of its breath, the scent of blood and swamp. Its amber eyes filled with a wild determination, fixed on her, a silent promise of protection. The alligators, however, were relentless. The scent of fresh tiger blood was an irresistible feast. The monster that had bitten the feline's paw, despite being wounded, did not retreat. It and two other reptiles, drawn by the predator's vulnerability, began to circle, their heads emerging and submerging in the dark water like hungry ghosts. The tiger, its injured paw hanging useless, spun its body using its mass and its hind paw to fend off the closest alligator. It growled, a hoarse warning, but the pain was evident in every contraction of its muscles. The elderly woman with fresh air in her lungs felt a faint surge of strength. She watched the tiger lower its head again, its sharp teeth close to the ropes that bound her. This time, it wasn't just sniffing. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt to free her. With a careful yet firm movement, it bit the ropes on her left wrist. The dampness made them slippery, and their thickness made the task difficult. It growled in frustration, the pain in its injured paw radiating throughout its body, but it persisted. Its teeth, capable of crushing bones, applied controlled pressure, severing fiber by fiber. One of the alligators, sensing the tiger's distraction, made a swift charge. It lunged out of the water, its jaws open in a lateral attack, aiming for the feline's unprotected flank. The tiger reacted with a warning roar, turning sharply and using its head to push the elderly woman back, out of the attack's path. With its good front paw and extended claws, it struck the reptile's snout, making it stumble and release a hiss of pain before retreating. The elderly woman felt the tension in the ropes ease slightly. The tiger had succeeded. With a final tug, the fibers snapped. Her left wrist was free, scarred and sore, but free. A wave of hope, as fragile as a leaf in the current, washed over her. She tried to move her arm, but exhaustion and stiff muscles prevented her. Still, it was a start. She could feel the difference, the possibility of fighting, of helping. The tiger, exhausted and bleeding, wasted no time. With a look that seemed to say, "Hold on," it turned to face the alligators still surrounding it. Its injured paw throbbed, but its determination was unyielding. It was a guardian, a protector, and it would not retreat. The elderly woman, now with her left arm free, tried to reach the ropes binding her body. Her numb, trembling fingers struggled against the tight knots. She knew time was running out. The tiger couldn't last much longer. With each breath, she smelled the metallic tang of blood, the swamp's mire, and the urgency of her own survival. Night was falling, and with it darkness would bring new horrors, new threats. The swamp, a humid tomb, had not yet finished its work. Night had fallen, and with it the promise of even greater terror. With both hands now free, the elderly woman didn't waste a second. Her fingers, though still numb and swollen, worked with a feverish, almost insane urgency. Each knot that bound her to the log felt like a death snare, and with each pull, each tearing of a fiber, she felt a searing pain in her abraded wrists. But the physical pain was a whisper compared to the roar of adrenaline in her veins, to the silent scream of survival echoing in her mind. She could feel the tiger's body trembling in the water, could hear its muffled snarls, each one a testament to its desperate struggle. The swamp, under the cloak of darkness, had transformed into a tangible nightmare. The fog, dense and cold, crept over the water's surface, enveloping everything in a ghostly veil. The twisted trees on the banks looked like monster silhouettes, and the sounds of the night, the amplified croaking of frogs, the incessant buzzing of insects, the splashing and hissing of unseen creatures, formed a macabre symphony. The icy air penetrated her bones, but the heat of determination spurred her on. She pulled a knot with a strength she didn't know she possessed, and it yielded with a wet snap. Another, and another. With each fiber that broke, a new wave of hope washed over her, mingled with the despair of knowing the tiger's time was running out. The feline, a wounded colossus, was now a sight of fury and agony. Its crushed front paw hung useless, and its torn flank gushed blood into the dark water, staining it a sinister red that spread like an ink blot. It moved with a broken grace, each movement a torture, but its amber eyes, once filled with wild determination, now burned with a flame of sacrifice. It was the barrier, the last bastion between the woman and the abyss. The alligators, opportunistic and relentless predators, smelled the tiger's blood. It was an irresistible invitation, a promise of easy meat that made them even bolder under the cover of darkness. The largest of them, the scarred monster, emerged again, its jaws open in a macabre grin, revealing dagger-sharp teeth. It advanced, no longer with its previous caution, but with the audacity of one who senses victory is near. 3 other reptiles followed, their dark silhouettes gliding beneath the surface, like hungry shadows. The sensation of freedom, even amidst the chaos and terror, was overwhelming. Her muscles, once stiff and numb, could now move, albeit with difficulty. She pushed away from the log, feeling the cold, muddy water beneath her feet. The instability of the swampy ground. But victory was tenuous. The tiger, exhausted and bleeding, was cornered. The alligators, now more numerous and bolder under the cloak of night, formed a tight circle around it. The scent of blood in the air was an invitation to the feast. The tiger let out a final roar, a sound that carried the pain of its wounds and the fury of its determination. It was a wounded warrior, but not yet defeated. The elderly woman, now completely free, looked at the tiger, at the unequal battle it was fighting for her. A new determination, cold and sharp, ignited in her eyes. She couldn't simply flee, not after everything it had done. She was weak, wounded, but not useless. She needed to help. But how? The swamp, with its growing darkness and relentless predators, still held its darkest secrets, and the battle for survival was far from over. Night had fallen, and with it, the promise of even greater terror. But now, the elderly woman was no longer bound, and the line between life and death seemed thinner than ever. She was prey, yes, but now she was prey that could fight. Freedom was a heavy burden, a weight of responsibility that fell upon her aching shoulders. The elderly woman, now untied, felt the unstable swamp ground beneath her feet, the muddy water engulfing her legs up to her knees. The night's cold seemed to penetrate to the marrow of her bones, but it was the heat of fury and determination that propelled her. She was prey, yes, but now she was prey that could fight. And she would fight, not for herself, but for the wounded colossus that was sacrificing itself for her. Her eyes scanned the darkness, desperately searching for something, anything that could turn the tide. The swamp, a labyrinth of shadows and dangers, offered few options. Twisted branches floated, but they were too thin, too fragile to face the reptile's armor. Stones. There were none in sight in the deep, murky water. Then her eyes fixed on the log that had held her captive moments before. Heavy, waterlogged, but still floating precariously. It might be her only chance. The tiger, a few meters from her, was a sight of agony and resilience. Its body, once a perfect hunting machine, was now torn. Its shoulder bled profusely, staining the water a dark red that spread like a shroud. It snarled, a hoarse, exhausted sound, as it struggled against the scarred monster that dragged it down, trying to drown it. 2 other alligators, sinister silhouettes in the fog, awaited their turn, their eyes gleaming with insatiable hunger. The scent of blood was a feast for them, an invitation to the final slaughter. The elderly woman knew time was running out. Each second was an eternity of pain for the tiger, one step closer to the end. With a silent cry of effort, she turned to the log. It was enormous, perhaps twice her own weight, but the water helped support part of it. She grasped the rough fibers of the wood, her broken nails scraping against the damp surface. Her already exhausted muscles protested, but she ignored the pain. She pulled, pushed, using every ounce of her strength, every fiber of her will. The log moved, slowly, with a muffled creak against the water. Her plan was simple, almost suicidal. use the log as a barrier, an improvised weapon, or perhaps a distraction. She wasn't sure, only that she needed to do something. The largest alligator, the scarred monster, felt the movement in the water and for an instant released the tiger, turning its massive head towards the elderly woman. Its cold, reptilian eyes fixed on her, recognizing the new threat, or perhaps the new prey. A low, menacing hiss escaped its jaws. The tiger, seizing the brief distraction, managed to break free, though at a terrible cost. It stumbled, its body trembling, and let out a warning roar to the elderly woman, as if telling her to flee, to save herself. But she did not yield. Her gaze met its, a silent promise that she would not abandon it. With a strength that seemed to come from a place beyond her fragile body, the elderly woman managed to pivot the log, positioning it between herself and the advancing alligator. The reptile, irritated by the interruption of its feast, charged with surprising speed. The elderly woman, with a guttural cry, pushed the log with everything she had. The impact was dull, a heavy thud that made water splash and the log vibrate in her hands. The alligator recoiled slightly, stunned but not wounded. Its armor was impenetrable, but the maneuver had created a moment of chaos. The other alligators, which had been approaching the tiger, were now momentarily confused. The tiger, seeing the woman's audacity, found a reserve of fury. It lunged at one of the smaller reptiles, its claws tearing into the animal's flank, which hissed and submerged. It was a minuscule victory, but a victory nonetheless. The elderly woman, panting, felt her entire body tremble. The effort had been immense. The log, heavy and slippery, was difficult to control, but she couldn't stop. The scarred monster, recovered from the shock, was preparing for a new attack, this time more determined. It opened its jaws, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and advanced no longer for the tiger, but directly for her. The tiger, perceiving the imminent danger, let out a desperate roar. It tried to move, but its wounded body did not respond with the same agility. The elderly woman, seeing the alligator's open mouth approach, felt a chilling cold run down her spine. She raised the log again, but knew a direct blow wouldn't be enough. She needed something more. Her eyes, in a flash of inspiration, fell upon a tangle of exposed roots from a thick vine hanging from a tree on the bank, a few meters away. If she could reach those roots, perhaps she could pull herself out of the water, or at least have a firmer foothold. But the alligator was almost upon her. With an instantaneous decision, she didn't push the log forward, but spun it sideways, using it to create a wave, a disturbance in the water, while she propelled herself with her legs towards the roots. The alligator, caught by surprise by the maneuver, hesitated for an instant, its head hitting the side of the log with a dull thud. It was enough. The elderly woman, with a final effort, grabbed the damp, slippery roots. Her still numb hands could barely hold on, but adrenaline gave her a supernatural strength. She pulled, feeling the mud slide beneath her feet, while the alligator, furious, lashed its tail in the water, creating a violent whirlpool. The tiger, seeing her move, let out a roar of encouragement, or perhaps of despair. It was now alone against the reptiles, but the woman was out of immediate reach of the jaws. She was not safe, far from it. The roots were precarious, and the swamp still teemed with danger, but she had gained a few precious seconds, and, more importantly, she had proven to herself that she could still fight. The scarred monster, with a roar of frustration, turned its attention back to the tiger which, though wounded, still stood its ground, and tireless guardian. The elderly woman, hanging from the roots, watched the battle, her heart pounding, her hands raw. Night, now complete, enveloped everything in a cloak of darkness, and the promise of even greater terror hung in the air. But now she had a new perspective, a new chance to intervene. The fight for survival had merely shifted its battleground. She clung to the roots, her raw fingers screaming in protest. The rough, damp fibers dug into her flesh, but the alternative was the cold, muddy embrace of the swamp, an invitation to death. Below her, the water churned, a dark canvas reflecting the spectral, faint glow of the moon, which struggled to pierce the dense tree canopy. Her legs dangled, barely touching the surface, making her a tempting target. Every muscle in her body vibrated with exhaustion, a constant tremor that threatened to betray her grip. The air, heavy with the scent of mud, decay, and now blood, filled her lungs with each ragged breath. Her eyes, wide with a mix of terror and fierce determination, darted to the battle unfolding a few meters away. The tiger, a silhouette of pain and fury, was a whirlwind of claws and teeth against the dark mass of alligators. The scarred monster, with its almost invulnerable hide, led the attack, its red eyes fixed on the great feline. It tried to drag the tiger into the depths, into the final embrace of darkness and death. The tiger roared, a sound that now seemed more a hoarse lament than a war cry, but still it fought. Each swipe of its paw, each bite, was an act of pure will, a refusal to yield. The elderly woman felt helplessness, a slow poison that threatened to paralyze her. She was out of the water, yes, but she was not safe. The roots were a temporary refuge, a fragile branch over the abyss. Her eyes scanned the bank, desperate for a weapon, a tool, anything that could tip the scales. The log she had used earlier had been swept away by the current, lost in the darkness. There were no stones, only slippery mud and dense, tangled vegetation. Then her eyes fixed on something more robust, more promising. One of the vines that formed the network of roots where she clung was considerably thicker, almost a small log itself, and hung more loosely, with a part submerged in the water. If she could break it, tear it off. It would be heavy, yes, but perhaps it could be used as a club or a battering ram. The idea was insane, but madness was the only path left. With a groan of effort, she began to move, her hands slipping and gripping again. She propelled herself, using her feet to brace against the lower roots, trying to reach the thicker vine. The pain in her shoulders and arms was excruciating, but the image of the tiger, stumbling under the relentless attack of the scarred monster, was a whip to her soul. The alligators, as if sensing the shift in the air, intensified their attack. The scarred monster managed a bite on the tiger's already torn flank, and the feline let out a roar of agony, sinking a little deeper into the water. Blood once again stained the surface, an irresistible invitation to the other approaching reptiles. The elderly woman knew there was no more time. With a guttural cry that ripped through the night stillness, she launched herself at the vine. Her hands, already raw, gripped the rough fiber, and she pulled with all the strength she had left. Her feet slipped in the mud, and for an instant she felt she would fall back into the water. Panic chilled her veins, but the image of the tiger, now almost submerged, propelled her. She pulled again, with a titanic effort, feeling the vine yield, the fibers stretching and snapping with a muffled crack. The pain in her hands was unbearable, but she didn't stop. A thick, heavy piece of the vine broke loose in her hands. It was irregular, with smaller roots still attached, but it was solid, and it was hers. She barely had time to breathe. The scarred monster, sensing the tiger weaken, was about to deliver the final blow, dragging it down. The elderly woman, vine in hand, did not hesitate. She propelled herself forward, using the strength of her legs to swing the heavy piece of wood. With a war cry that seemed to come from an ancestral place, she hurled it. The vine, propelled by fury and desperation, flew through the air, striking the scarred monster with surprising force. Not on its impenetrable hide, but on the side of its head, just above the eye, where the skin was slightly softer. The impact was a wet, heavy thud, and the alligator let out a sharp hiss of pain and surprise, recoiling for an instant, disoriented. The tiger, on the verge of collapse, seized the opportunity. With a last flash of energy, it broke free from the scarred monster's bite and with a furious roar leaped onto another smaller alligator that was approaching, sinking its claws and teeth into its neck. The reptile thrashed violently, but the tiger did not release it, its fury renewed by the woman's intervention. The elderly woman, panting, felt adrenaline pump through her veins. Her hands were raw. The vine had fallen back into the water, but she had succeeded. She had turned the tide, if only for a brief moment. The scarred monster, recovering from the blow, turned its massive head towards her, its red eyes gleaming with even greater fury. She was no longer just prey, she was an impediment, a threat. It advanced, this time with murderous determination, ignoring the tiger that was now fighting the smaller alligator. The elderly woman knew she couldn't face it directly. She needed a new strategy, and fast. Her eyes scanned the darkness again, searching for an escape, a new foothold. The roots, though precarious, kept her out of immediate reach, but the alligator was climbing, its front paws scratching the muddy bank, trying to reach her. The swamp, with its amplified night sounds, seemed to mock her audacity. The croaking of frogs, the buzzing of insects, the splashing and hissing of reptiles formed a macabre symphony. The fog, denser now, enveloped everything in a ghostly veil, transforming the twisted trees into somber monsters. She needed to move, to get out of that fixed spot. Looking up, she saw a thicker, more stable branch extending over the water a few meters above her. If she could reach that branch, perhaps she could pull herself to a safer position, or perhaps find a new weapon, a new angle of attack. With a desperate effort, the elderly woman began to climb, using the roots as improvised steps. Her muscles screamed, but she ignored the pain, focused only on the branch above. The scarred monster was almost reaching her, its jaws opening and closing with a menacing snap. She felt the reptile's foul breath on her heels, the promise of a brutal death. One last pull, a cry of effort, and her raw, bleeding hands grasped the branch. She hauled herself up, hanging precariously, while the alligator snarled in frustration, its jaws snapping at empty air, inches from her feet. She was out of reach, for now. But the branch swayed dangerously, and the height wasn't great enough to guarantee her safety. She was in a trap, suspended between heaven and hell, and the night was still young. The battle for survival had transformed into a deadly game of cat and mouse, and the elderly woman, exhausted and wounded, was the prey who refused to die. Hanging, suspended between heaven and hell, the elderly woman felt every fiber of her being scream in protest. The damp, slippery branch swayed dangerously under her weight, a promise of imminent fall. Below her, the scarred monster snarled, a guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the swamp itself. Its red eyes, beacons of hatred in the darkness, were fixed on her, and its jaws, an abyss of sharp teeth, snapped with insatiable hunger. The reptile's foul breath rose, a constant reminder of the death that awaited her. She was out of immediate reach, yes, but she was not safe. The branch was a trap, a fixed point that the alligator would soon discover how to exploit. The reptile was not just brute force, it was cunning, patient. She could feel the vibration of the branch, not just from her own trembling, but from something more, a disturbance coming from below. The scarred monster was moving, its front paws scratching the muddy bank, trying to climb, trying to reach the base of the tree, perhaps to shake the branch, to dislodge her. The pain in her hands was searing, raw flesh exposed to the rough wood. Her already exhausted muscles began to fail, and with each breath, the heavy swamp air seemed to suffocate her. The scent of blood, hers and the tiger's, mingled with the odor of decomposition, creating a macabre fragrance that permeated the night. Her desperate eyes scanned the darkness. The tiger, where was her guardian? A weak roar, almost a whimper, cut through the air. It still fought, but the sound was one of desperation, not fury. The image of the great feline, stumbling under the relentless attack of the other alligators, was a whip to her soul. She couldn't afford to fall, couldn't give in. The tiger needed her as much as she needed it. She needed to move, but where? Above her, the tree trunk rose, dark and imposing, its cracks and protrusions offering a path, perhaps, to temporary safety. But the climb would be brutal, and the branch she was on was the only bridge. The scarred monster intensified its efforts. It used its massive head to push the base of the tree, a calculated move to shake the branch. The elderly woman felt a violent jolt, and for an instant, her heart stopped. She clung on with renewed strength, her knuckles white, pain exploding in her arms. The branch groaned, its fibers snapping, threatening to give way. There was no time to hesitate. She had to go up. With a groan of effort, she began to drag herself along the branch like a wounded animal. Every inch was agony, her knees and elbows scraping against the rough wood, her clothes torn, her skin abraded. The scarred monster, realizing her intention, redoubled its attacks on the base of the tree, and the branch swayed like a mad pendulum. She reached the point where the branch met the main trunk. It was a thick, more stable junction, but the vertical climb would be even more challenging. Her eyes scanned the trunk, searching for handholds, cracks, anything that could serve as a step. Darkness was an enemy, obscuring details, transforming every shadow into a potential danger. Then she saw it. A little above her head, where the branch joined the trunk, there was a protrusion. A kind of wooden knot, and just above it a deep crevice, almost a small hollow. It wasn't much, but it was a start. With one last look at the tiger, which was now almost completely submerged, fighting with desperate ferocity against the tide of reptiles, the elderly woman gathered her last strength. She pushed herself up, using her feet to brace against the unstable branch, and stretched out a hand, her fingers trembling, towards the knot. Her fingers grazed the wood, slipped, and for an instant she felt she would fall. Panic chilled her veins, but the image of the tiger, her guardian, her last hope, propelled her. With a hoarse cry, she tried again, this time with more determination, more desperation. Her raw fingers grasped the knot, and she pulled, feeling the pain tear through her shoulders. With a titanic effort, she managed to haul herself up, her feet finding purchase on the roots that stretched along the base of the trunk. She was now higher, but still not safe. The scarred monster, frustrated, lashed its tail in the water with a deafening fury, sending waves that struck the base of the tree. It couldn't reach her directly, but its presence was a constant threat. The elderly woman, panting, leaned her head against the trunk, feeling the rough bark against her sweaty skin. She had gained a few more meters, a few more seconds, but the swamp still teemed, and the night was still a dark canvas for the horrors that lurked. She needed to keep climbing, find a safer refuge or a new weapon. The fight for survival was far from over, and every step, every movement was a gamble against death. She was no longer a defenseless prey. She was a fighter, and the swamp was about to discover the true strength of her will. With each meter gained, exhaustion became a thicker layer over her bones. The humid, heavy swamp air entered her lungs like sand, and her heart beat an erratic rhythm, a war drum in her chest. Her hands, raw and bleeding, gripped the rough bark of the tree, finding small footholds, tiny crevices that seemed designed to challenge her determination. She no longer felt pain in isolation. It was a generalized ache that consumed her entire body. But her mind refused to yield. The scarred monster below did not give up. It circled the base of the tree, its red eyes fixed on her as if calculating every move, every weakness. Suddenly, it recoiled slightly and with surprising speed for its size, propelled itself forward, slamming its massive head against the tree trunk with a dull, powerful thud. The entire tree shook violently, and the elderly woman lost her balance for an instant, her body swaying dangerously to the side. A cry of panic escaped her lips, but she quickly clung on with renewed strength, her nails breaking against the wood. The alligator repeated the attack, and with each impact, the tree groaned, its roots seeming to tear free from the muddy earth. She looked down at the bubbling chaos of the water. The tiger. It was almost gone, only its head and one front paw visible, desperately fighting against three smaller alligators that dragged it into the depths. Its roars were now only muffled gurgles, a lament of despair. The sight ignited a savage fury within her. She couldn't leave it, not after everything. It was her guardian, her improbable companion on this hellish journey. With a determination that seemed to come from a place beyond exhaustion, the elderly woman forced herself to look up again. The darkness was dense, but the fog seemed to dissipate slightly above, revealing the silhouette of a thicker branch, extending horizontally a good 3 meters above her. It was a robust branch, covered with moss and some parasitic plants, and seemed to offer a safer refuge, perhaps even an observation point, but reaching it would be a Herculean challenge. The part of the trunk separating her from the branch was smoother, with fewer handholds. She began to climb again, using her elbows and knees to drag herself, her feet searching for any protrusion, any roughness in the bark. Every movement was torture, but the image of the tiger, fighting for its life, was fuel. The scarred monster continued its attacks on the base of the tree, but its blows seemed less effective now that she was higher. It snarled in frustration, its tail lashing the water, but she was focused. With one last desperate effort, the elderly woman managed to reach the thick branch. She threw herself onto it, gasping, her body trembling uncontrollably. The wood was damp and cold, but solid. She dragged herself a little further to the center of the branch, feeling a little safer, though still exposed. From up there, she had a wider view of the swamp. The fog, though still present, was not as dense, and the pale moonlight, which could now penetrate a little more, revealed a scene of horror. The tiger. It had managed to break free, but it was severely wounded. It stumbled in the shallow water, its body covered in deep lacerations, blood staining the water around it. The smaller alligators, though wounded, still surrounded it, waiting for the moment to deliver the final blow. The scarred monster had stopped its attacks on the tree and now observed the scene, like a general awaiting the victory of his troops. The elderly woman felt a tightening in her chest. The tiger was dying, and she was trapped, helpless. But then, her eyes scanned the branch she was on. Among the parasitic plants and moss, something caught her attention. It was an abandoned bird's nest made of dry twigs and intertwined vines, and within it, partially hidden, was a stone. Not a common swamp stone, but a dark, heavy rock, with one edge sharp, almost like a blade. It seemed to have been carried there by some flood or animal. A flash of hope, wild and desperate, ignited in her eyes. It wasn't a sophisticated weapon, but it was a weapon, and she was willing to use it. With her still sore hands, she stretched her fingers, feeling the roughness of the stone. It was heavy, more than she expected, but manageable. She pulled it from the nest, feeling the familiar weight in her hands. The elderly woman was no longer just prey. She was a warrior, armed with the fury of survival and a piece of rock. The battle was far from over, but now she had a chance, a small but real chance. The weight of the stone in her hands was a harsh reminder of reality. It was not a weapon of war, but a fragment of the earth, raw and imperfect, with a single edge that promised a blow. The scent of moss and damp earth mingled with the iron of blood, and the sight of the tiger, its torn body barely visible beneath the surface, was a dagger in her chest. It was dying, and she, up above, felt like a helpless spectator. But no more. The stone was her answer, her fury condensed into rock. Her eyes fixed on the scarred monster below. It wasn't attacking the tree now, but observing, with a cold, predatory intelligence, the siege on the tiger. It was the general, the strategist. If she could wound it, perhaps chaos would ensue, perhaps the others would retreat. It was a desperate gamble, but the only one she had. With trembling hands but a focused mind, she raised the stone. There was no room for a powerful throw from that height, and precision would be crucial. She would need gravity, weight, a precise strike. She took a deep breath, the heavy, humid air burning her lungs. The pain in her arms and shoulders was a constant, but now it was a battle cry, not a lament. She aimed. The scarred monster was a few meters from the base of the tree, its massive head partially submerged, its red eyes fixed on the tiger. It was a large target, but moving slowly, calculatingly. She needed to hit the head, the most vulnerable point, or at least the most sensitive. With a hoarse groan that was lost in the swamp's whisper, she released the stone. It wasn't a throw, it was a release, an act of faith and desperation. The dark rock cut through the humid air, a silent projectile that seemed to carry all the weight of her rage and her hope. For an instant, the world seemed to stop. The sound of bubbling water, the distant snarls of the alligators, the very beat of her heart, everything fell silent. Then the impact, a hollow, heavy sound, like a hammer striking a wet log, echoed through the swamp. The stone hit the scarred monster squarely on the top of its head, where the skin was tougher, but the impact was undeniable. The alligator let out a roar of pain and fury, a guttural sound that made the water tremble. Its head rose violently, and it lashed its tail with explosive force, sending a wave that crashed against the base of the tree. The shock was immediate. The smaller alligators surrounding the tiger, startled by their leader's unexpected reaction, recoiled for a brief instant, breaking the siege. The scarred monster spun in a frenzy, its eyes now fixed on her, on the fragile figure on the branch above. The pain in its head was palpable, and its fury was an almost tangible force. Down below, the tiger, which seemed on the verge of exhaustion, felt the change. The pressure eased, and it seized the moment. With a weak but determined roar, it propelled itself, using its last strength to fend off one of the alligators that was approaching again. It managed to surface a little more, gasping, its body trembling but alive. The sight of the elderly woman on the branch, the smoke of her courage, rekindled a small flame in its eyes. The elderly woman, in turn, felt a wave of exhaustion hit her. The effort of releasing the stone, the tension of the moment, all took their toll. But there was also a flash of triumph, a bitter taste of victory. She had done something, she had fought back. But the victory was fleeting. The scarred monster was not mortally wounded, merely enraged. It began to circle the base of the tree with renewed speed, its tail lashing the water with deafening fury. It couldn't reach her directly, but its presence was a constant threat, and the tree seemed to groan under the pressure of its rage. She looked at the tiger again. It was more visible now, but its wounds were deep, and it stumbled. It had gained a few seconds, perhaps a minute, but the tide was still against it. The smaller alligators, though momentarily dispersed, began to regroup, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of an easy meal. The elderly woman was once again unarmed. The stone had served its purpose, but now she was exposed, vulnerable. She dragged herself a little further to the center of the branch, seeking firmer support, her eyes scanning the darkness for anything else, any other hope. The fog, which had seemed to dissipate earlier, now began to thicken again, transforming the swamp into a labyrinth of shadows and menacing sounds. The fight for survival was far from over. She had wounded the monster, but she had also awakened its fury. The tiger was on the verge of death, and she was trapped, a potential target. But amidst the despair, there was a new clarity. She was no longer prey fleeing. She was a combatant, and the swamp was about to discover that the will of a determined woman could be as sharp as any blade. The night was still young, and the battle just beginning. The scarred monster's fury was not just a snarl, it was a primordial force. A tremor that climbed through the tree's roots and traveled up the trunk to the branch where the elderly woman clung. The stone's blow, though not lethal, had wounded its pride and awakened a savage rage. It no longer circled, it attacked. With a brutal charge, its massive jaws clamped around the base of the trunk, not to bite and drag, but to crush, to break the old tree's support. The sound of wood cracking and splitting was deafening, a cry of agony that echoed through the swamp. The elderly woman felt the branch tremble violently, as if the tree itself were convulsing. She clung on with all her might, her nails tearing at the damp bark, her muscles screaming in protest. The impact made her body swing dangerously, and for an instant, she thought she would be hurled into the dark water below, into the cold embrace of the smaller alligators that were already regrouping. The scarred monster recoiled slightly, only to attack again, with even greater ferocity, like a living battering ram. Each charge was an earthquake. Each bite tore away splinters of wood, exposing the sap and deeper fiber of the trunk. The tree groaned, and the elderly woman could feel the structure yielding, the roots tearing free from the muddy soil. It was only a matter of time. Below, the tiger, stumbling and bleeding, witnessed the scene. The sight of the elderly woman in danger, the tree that was its only refuge being destroyed, ignited a last spark of courage in its cloudy eyes. It knew it couldn't fight the scarred monster directly in its state, but it could create a distraction. With a roar that was more a squeal of pain, it lunged at the group of smaller alligators that were approaching, not to kill, but to drive them away, to disperse them, to buy time. It used what remained of its speed and agility, spinning and lashing with its front paw, its claws tearing the scaly skin of one of the reptiles. The attack was desperate, reckless, but effective. The smaller alligators, though greater in number, hesitated, dividing their attention between the wounded tiger and the promise of an easy meal. The elderly woman, her heart beating wildly, looked at the tiger. It was fighting a losing battle, sacrificing itself for her. A wave of despair and gratitude washed over her. She couldn't let it die in vain. She needed to do something. Her eyes scanned the branch again, searching for anything, any hope. The fog was denser now, enveloping the swamp in an opaque shroud, but the pale moonlight still managed to pierce through in some spots, revealing distorted shadows and shapes. Then she saw it. It wasn't a weapon, but an opportunity. Near where the branch joined the main trunk, a section of bark had been torn away by the violence of previous attacks, revealing the inner wood. And there, caught between the fibers, was a series of long, sharp splinters, like small wooden daggers, a result of the tree's stress and rupture. One of them was particularly robust, almost a small skewer, with a naturally sharp point. With trembling hands, but renewed determination, the elderly woman stretched out her arm, ignoring the searing pain in her muscles. She grasped the largest splinter, feeling the roughness of the wood in her fingers. It was harder to pull off than it seemed, firmly stuck. She pulled, twisted, used her body weight. Sweat streamed down her face, mingling with mud and tears of effort. Finally, with a dry snap, the splinter broke free in her hands. It was imperfect, irregular, but it was a weapon, a rudimentary spear, born from the very tree that protected her. The scarred monster continued its attacks on the base of the tree, the trunk now visibly compromised, deep cracks spreading through the wood. The elderly woman knew she didn't have much time. She couldn't descend to fight it, nor could she throw the splinter with the same precision as the stone. But she could use it. She could use it to defend herself or to attack in a different way. Her eyes fixed on the giant alligator. It was so focused on bringing down the tree that it didn't seem to notice the new threat above. The elderly woman crawled to the edge of the branch, positioning herself. The splinter was light, but the tip was sharp. She needed a target, a vulnerable spot. The head was too hard, the body covered by impenetrable scales. But what about the eyes, or the underside of the jaw, perhaps? The tiger below was at its last stand. It had managed to fend off the smaller alligators for a moment, but it was exhausted, its body trembling, blood staining the water. It looked up at the elderly woman, and its eyes, though weary, seemed to plead for one last hope. The elderly woman took a deep breath. The smell of decay and blood was overwhelming. The sound of wood splitting was a constant warning. She was not a warrior, but the fury of survival had transformed the frail elderly woman into something more. She was the tiger's guardian, and it hers. With the wooden splinter in hand, she waited, her heart beating like a war drum. The battle was far from over, and the swamp, with its shadows and its horrors, was about to witness the resilience of a woman who refused to die. The night was still long, and the fight bloody. The scarred monster delivered one last devastating blow against the base of the tree. A guttural sound, a mix of crack and tear, echoed through the swamp, and the tree finally gave way. It wasn't a sudden fall, but a slow, agonizing toppling, like a wounded giant bending under its own weight. The elderly woman felt the branch tilt violently, the world spinning around her. She clung to the splinter with desperate strength, her body swaying in the humid air. The dark water below approached rapidly, and with it the open jaws of the smaller alligators, which thrashed in a frenzy, anticipating the fall. But the tree's fall was not just a disaster, it was also an opportunity. As the trunk tilted, the scarred monster, which was positioned at the base, was caught by surprise. It tried to move away, but the gigantic mass of the falling tree grazed it, pushing it slightly to the side and exposing a part of its head that had previously been protected. For a brief but eternal instant, the elderly woman saw. Her eyes, sharpened by terror and adrenaline, fixed on the underside of the reptile's jaw, where the skin seemed a little softer, less armored. It was a tiny target, but it was the only one she had. With a scream that was lost in the crack of wood and the bubbling of water, the elderly woman propelled herself. It was not an elegant leap, but an act of calculated desperation. She used the momentum of the falling tree to launch herself forward, extending her arm with the wooden splinter. All her weight, all her rage, all her hope converged on that single point. The sharp tip of the splinter found its target. With a wet thud and a tearing sound, the wood penetrated the soft flesh beneath the alligator's jaw. The effect was immediate and cataclysmic. The scarred monster let out a roar of pain and fury that made the swamp tremble. Its head rose violently, lashing the air, and it spun in a blind frenzy. The splinter still embedded in its jaw, an agonizing reminder of its wound. The tree finally crashed into the water with a deafening roar, raising a gigantic wave that swept everything in its path. The elderly woman was thrown to the side, losing control of the splinter, which dislodged from the alligator's jaw and disappeared into the dark water. She fell into the water, but not directly amidst the alligators. The wave threw her against the remains of the tree, which now floated like a tangle of branches and roots. She emerged gasping, coughing up water and mud, her body aching and exhausted. The fog, now denser than ever, enveloped the scene in a ghostly veil. The scarred monster still thrashed furiously, its pain and rage preventing it from focusing on a target. The smaller alligators, startled by the commotion and their leader's fury, dispersed momentarily, creating a small space of relative safety around the elderly woman. But the victory was tenuous. The tree, her refuge, was destroyed. She was in the water, surrounded by debris, and the giant alligator, though wounded, was not dead. Its fury was palpable, and the wound in its jaw only served to increase its thirst for revenge. She looked around desperately. The tiger. Where was the tiger? Amidst the chaos of the falling tree and the alligator's frenzy, she had lost sight of it. A chilling panic seized her. It was on the verge of exhaustion, and now, with the tree down, it would be even more vulnerable. A faint sound, a whimper barely audible above the bubbling water, caught her attention. Near one of the thicker branches of the fallen tree, a dark shape struggled. It was the tiger. It was trapped, partially submerged, one of the branches pinning it underwater. It had been hit by the falling tree, or perhaps by the smaller alligators it had been trying to fend off. Its eyes, which had once shone with dying hope, were now cloudy, almost lifeless. The elderly woman felt a new wave of despair. She had fought, had wounded the monster, but now she was in the water, unarmed, and the tiger, her protector, was on the verge of death, trapped. The swamp, with its shadows and its horrors, seemed to close in on her. The night was still long, and the battle far from over. In fact, it had merely shifted its stage, and the new setting was even more dangerous. The elderly woman, her body trembling with cold and exhaustion, knew time was running out. She needed to act, and fast, or both would be devoured by the swamp's darkness. The elderly woman, her body trembling with cold and exhaustion, knew time was running out. She needed to act, and fast, or both would be devoured by the swamp's darkness. Her eyes, burning with the smoke of adrenaline and despair, fixed on the tiger. It was there, a few meters away, trapped under the brutal weight of a fallen tree branch, the dark water licking its snout, threatening to swallow it at any instant. The faint whimper escaping its throat was a lament, a silent plea for help that pierced the woman's heart. She didn't think. She just acted. Every muscle in her body protested, every fiber screamed in pain. But the image of the tiger, her protector, her improbable companion drowning, was a hell she couldn't bear. Propelling herself through the floating debris of the tree, she began to swim, or rather, crawl, through the muddy water. Broken branches and twisted roots formed a treacherous barrier, scratching her already torn skin, but she ignored them. The scent of blood, now even more intense with the giant alligator's wound, mingled with the putrid odor of the swamp, creating a suffocating atmosphere. The scarred monster still thrashed furiously some distance away, its head lashing the air. The splinter she had embedded in its jaw now lost, but the pain, the fury, were palpable. Its roars echoed, a constant warning of the threat that still loomed. The smaller alligators, though momentarily dispersed, began to regroup, their dark silhouettes gliding stealthily through the fog like hungry ghosts. The elderly woman could feel their gazes, their chilling presences. Lie. She reached the tiger. It was partially submerged. A thick, heavy branch pinning it at shoulder height, preventing it from breathing properly. Its eyes, once so vibrant, were almost closed, a haze of pain and resignation covering them. The water around it was tinged with red, not only from its own blood, but also from the giant alligators, which continued to stain the surface. "Hold on. My friend," she murmured, her voice hoarse, almost inaudible. "I won't leave you." She tried to push the branch, but it was too heavy, firmly stuck. Her already exhausted arms could barely move it an inch. She tried to lift, to use her body weight, but the wood was unyielding. The tiger let out another whimper, a sound of pure suffering, and the elderly woman felt a wave of chilling panic. It was drowning. Her eyes scanned the tangle of branches and roots floating around. She needed leverage, needed something strong enough to move that weight. Her hand fumbled in the water, feeling the roughness of the wood, the sliminess of the mud. Then her fingers found something. A part of the main trunk of the fallen tree had broken in a peculiar way, creating a kind of robust fork. It was heavy, but perhaps it could be used. With superhuman effort, she managed to drag the fork to the branch that pinned the tiger. Carefully positioning it under the branch, she used a smaller piece of wood as a fulcrum, trying to create leverage. She pushed with all the strength she had left, teeth clenched, her face contorted into a mask of determination. The branch creaked, moved a millimeter, then another. It was agonizing, slow. As she struggled, a dark shadow glided close. A smaller alligator, drawn by the blood and vulnerability, emerged from the fog, its yellow eyes fixed on the tiger. The elderly woman had no weapon, but she had the fury of a lioness. With a guttural cry, she dropped the fork for an instant and lunged forward, pounding her fists on the reptile's head. The alligator recoiled, surprised by the unexpected ferocity, but not for long. It spun in the water, ready to attack again. The elderly woman couldn't fight it. She needed to free the tiger. Returning to the fork, she pushed again with more desperation. The branch yielded a little more. The tiger, feeling the pressure ease, made a final effort. A tremor in its body, and with a gasp, managed to move enough for its head to be completely above the water. It coughed, expelling water and air, its eyes opening slightly, fixing on the elderly woman with an almost human gratitude. But they were still not safe. The smaller alligator, irritated, advanced again, and the scarred monster, though still disoriented, seemed to be calming down, its movements becoming more focused, its roars diminishing to deep snarls. It was searching. The elderly woman knew they couldn't stay there. The tiger was free from the branch, but it was still severely wounded, unable to fight or swim effectively. They needed solid ground, a refuge. Her eyes scanned the fog, searching for anything that could offer shelter. Visibility was almost nil, but the pale moonlight, which occasionally pierced the opaque veil, revealed an indistinct shape in the distance. A dark mass, higher than the water, seemed to be a small island of land, or perhaps a rocky elevation. It was their only hope. "Come on, my friend," she whispered to the tiger, stroking its wet head. "We need to go." With a combined effort, the elderly woman and the tiger, which could now move a little, began to drag themselves through the tree's debris. She guided it, using the branches for support, pushing it when it hesitated, her own willpower fueling it. The smaller alligator followed them closely, its jaws snapping, a constant threat. And the scarred monster, now calmer, began to move towards them, the wound in its jaw a bloody reminder of its fury. The night was still long, and the swamp with its shadows and horrors seemed determined not to let them escape. The elderly woman and the tiger, united by a bond of survival, now faced the most dangerous part of their journey, the open crossing, vulnerable, in search of a sanctuary that might not even exist. With each stroke, each drag, each glance back, the tension mounted. The swamp was a graveyard, and they were the next to be buried, unless the resilience of a woman and the courage of a tiger could once again defy death. The dark mass on the horizon, a promise of solid ground, seemed to float further with each effort, a deceptive beacon in the opaque darkness. The elderly woman, her heart beating erratically in her chest, felt the cold water erode her last reserves of energy. The tiger, by her side, moved with painful slowness, each movement a testament to its exhaustion and the invisible wounds that tore at it. The smaller alligator, a persistent and opportunistic predator, glided like a hungry shadow, its yellow eyes gleaming through the fog. It didn't attack directly, but its presence was a psychological torment, a constant reminder of the death that stalked them. The elderly woman could feel the reptile's putrid breath each time it drew near, its jaws snapping in the air, a sound that pierced the swamp's heavy silence. She used the remains of the fallen tree as improvised shields, pushing branches aside, creating a momentary barrier between them and the imminent danger. But the greater threat, the scarred monster, was approaching. Its deep snarls, once disoriented, now carried a sinister intent. The wound in its jaw, though still bleeding, did not diminish its fury, only intensified it. It moved with relentless determination, the water bubbling around it, creating small waves that rocked the debris and pushed them closer to the abyss. The elderly woman could feel the vibration of its colossal body through the water, a premonition of a final, devastating attack. "Just a little further, my friend," she whispered to the tiger, her voice hoarse with effort and despair. She pushed it, guided it, her hand on its wet fur, a vital connection between two lost souls. The tiger, in response, made a superhuman effort, its muscles trembling, its eyes fixed on the distant promise of land. Suddenly, the water around them exploded. The smaller alligator, impatient, launched its attack. It lunged at the tiger, its jaws open, ready to tear. But even wounded, the tiger was still a predator. With a weak roar, but full of primordial fury, it spun in the water, its sharp claws tearing the side of the smaller reptile. The alligator let out a yelp of pain and recoiled, but not before its fangs tore the tiger's hind leg, opening a new wound that stained the water an even more intense red. The elderly woman screamed, a guttural sound of rage and despair. She couldn't lose the tiger, not now. She turned to the smaller alligator, grabbing a pointed branch that floated nearby. With a strength she didn't know she still possessed, she hurled it at the reptile, hitting it on the head. The alligator, stunned, dove into the depths, disappearing into the fog. But the distraction was fatal. The scarred monster used the moment of vulnerability. With a deafening roar, it emerged from the water, its gigantic body raising a wave that engulfed them. The elderly woman was thrown to the side, losing the branch, her vision blurred by water and mud. When she emerged, coughing and gasping, she saw terror materialize. The giant alligator was between them and solid ground, its massive body blocking the way. Its eyes, once filled with pain, now burned with a cold, calculating thirst for revenge. The tiger, with its injured paw, tried to move, but its movements were slow, clumsy. The monster advanced, its jaws opening in a terrifying arc, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The elderly woman knew it was the end. She no longer had the strength to fight, nor weapons to defend herself. But the tiger, its protector, had not given up. With one last desperate roar, it propelled itself forward. Not against the monster, but to the side, towards the only opening left. It knew it couldn't defeat the giant alligator in a direct fight, but it could create a distraction. The monster, surprised by the unexpected maneuver, spun to reach it, its jaws snapping in the air. The elderly woman saw the opportunity. With a war cry that ripped through her throat, she threw herself into the water, swimming with renewed ferocity, propelled by desperation and the promise of life. She slipped behind the giant alligator, using its massive body as cover. The tiger, despite its wounds, continued to draw the monster's attention, swimming in circles, exhausting its last reserves of energy. Solid ground was a few meters away. The elderly woman could feel the mud beneath her feet, the promise of solidity. She dragged herself out of the water, her lungs burning, her muscles in spasms. She turned, extending her hand to the tiger. "Come on, come," she cried. Her voice choked. The tiger, with a final effort, managed to break free from the giant alligator, which, furious, lunged at the remains of the fallen tree, tearing the wood in a blind frenzy. The tiger, stumbling, dragged itself out of the water, its eyes fixed on the elderly woman's, a deep and exhaustive gratitude shining in them. It collapsed in the mud, gasping, but alive. They were on the island, a small rise of land covered by dense vegetation. The scarred monster, still in its blind fury, continued to attack the water and debris, unable to reach them on solid ground. The smaller alligators, scared by their leader's rage, kept their distance. The elderly woman collapsed beside the tiger, embracing its wet, wounded neck. Tears streamed down her face, tears of exhaustion, of relief, of immense gratitude. They had survived. The swamp, with its horrors and shadows, had been challenged and, for now, conquered. The night was still long, but the darkness no longer seemed so oppressive. The pale moonlight, which now pierced the veil of fog, revealed the extent of their wounds, but also the strength of their resilience. They were wounded, exhausted, but they were together, and that was enough. The battle against the swamp had ended, but the journey of survival was far from over. They had found a temporary sanctuary, a refuge in the darkness, and the promise of a new dawn, where perhaps, just perhaps, hope could finally bloom.